There's been a lot of talk of late in relation to the contamination caused to properties by the use and production of methamphetamine. Now, while the testing of properties for contamination might be something that's quite new here in Australia, we only need look at our neighbours in New Zealand who have been actively testing properties for some time to see how things will likely progress moving forward. Now, while testing of properties will largely be focused on rental properties, there is a growing trend for houses to be tested when being sold as part of the contract for sale, being subject to the passing of a meth test. Luckily, Stephen from OCTIEF, a meth testing company, reached out to help explain the process and was kind enough to sit down on camera. Enjoy.
So contamination can come from the tenants of a property operating an illegal drug lab, or it could come from longer term exposure to people smoking meth or ice in the property as well. Historically, I guess most people were only aware of contamination coming from drug labs, so certainly there's a lot of focus there, and that's where we get engaged quite often, is where there's a known contamination issue from a drug lab. But certainly as people are becoming more aware of the health risks with smoking meth in a property and the residue left behind, that's by and far the larger portion of our testing these days. In our business in New Zealand, across our 5 branches there, we see over 50% of the tests come back as positive to some level of contamination. Now, that's not all of them above a safe or below a safe level. That's a presence in around 50%. In Australia, it's probably higher because it's probably around 80% positive hits in Australia. Now, that's not necessarily because there's more use in Australia, but probably from where our inquiries are coming from, where people are testing on suspicion of tenants or previous occupants using the drug in the property. Historically, the positive rate was much higher because it was done around suspicion testing, but as the market has adopted more of a proactive screening approach, that's where we've seen the positives come down to around that 50% at the moment. Of that 50%, around 50% of those have exceeded the safe guidelines. So approximately 25% of what we've tested has come back at levels that exceed the health-based standards. Well, the chemical can be detected after single use in a property, but it builds up over time. So it's usually longer term exposure from tenant smoke or property tenants smoking meth that creates that high level of contamination. Given the nature of the drug, higher toxicity levels will leave more residue than lower toxicity levels, and certainly exposure over time, and depending on how they've ventilated the property and everything else. So there's a lot of variables there as to whether it's 1 or 10 or 20 or 100 times that require. The Australian government has released the clandestine drug lab remediation guidelines, which is a very strict approach to remediating for both methamphetamine residue as well as other precursor chemicals that are carcinogens in the property. So depending on the level of contamination determines the remediation method, and there's no one single approach to remediation. If we're talking about residue from smoking ice in the property, in lower levels of contamination, a detailed clean can often remove the residue. In higher levels of contamination, it needs a deconstruction, so we're talking about stripping out interior fittings. But the residue binds itself to soft furnishings, so at a minimum level we remove carpets, or we'd advise removal of carpets, fans, anything that circulates air through the property, and then deal with other hard surfaces depending on how they're treated. So if they're more porous, they might need to be removed, but if they're well sealed, it might mean that we can do a surface clean. Under the Australian clandestine laboratory remediation guidelines, anything above 0.5 micrograms per 100 square centimetres needs to be remediated. When we're talking about contamination from a non-drug lab scenario where someone's been smoking meth in a property, we look to our neighbouring partners such as New Zealand who have done studies, and it's usually anything around 1.5 to 2 micrograms per 100 square centimetres. Anything above that level is deemed to be unsafe in New Zealand. Australia doesn't have the same level of regulations of screening for properties for meth contamination from use that New Zealand does. There are standards around what the screening looks like, and they're being developed at the moment and being workshopped into the market. But there is an expectation, same as in Australia, that landlords provide properties in safe and habitable conditions, and that's been tested through some court challenges in New Zealand now. But in Australia, we've seen a lot more demand for this screening service that we've been offering. And I think that it won't be dictated by the government so much as the public will start to adopt it over time as they become more aware of what chemical residue contamination risks pose for their families. We see issues such as children exhibiting ADHD or attention or problems with focusing and attention. Longer term exposure can cause damage to organs such as kidneys and livers. And we also are aware that it can cause reproductive issues such as birth defects and miscarriages as well. Cleaners quote from a couple of $1,000s for a clean of a property at low levels of contamination, right through to where there's deconstruction and reinstatement required, up to $100,000 to $200,000 on more sophisticated homes. Typically, we can offer a screening service for around $550 per property, and that's for a standard 3 to 4 bedroom style home, which will establish if there is some baseline residue left in the property. If you're talking about a more detailed investigation for a clandestine laboratory, it starts at a few $1,000s, given the scientific nature of that testing as well. From the time we arrive on site to getting laboratory results back, it's typically a 5-day turnaround time. If you're interested in screening of a property to determine, say, a baseline level of contamination, the best way to do that is to jump on to our website, www.screenformeth.com.au, where you can organise just a baseline test, and that'll allow you to establish whether there is or isn't any meth contamination already in a property. If you're talking about a known or a suspected drug lab scenario, or known if there's been police activity there, you're better off calling OCTIEF directly to engage one of our occupational scientists, because that level of testing is far more detailed.
If you want to learn more about what OCTIEF does and how to get in contact with them, there'll be a link in the description. Click here for another video we did, give us a thumbs up if you found this helpful, comment with more stuff you want to know about, and for more demystified insurance jargon, click that subscribe button.